Welcome, everybody. We'll be starting very shortly. We're just waiting for the audience to join. So, welcome to this CND event entitled Talks Not Bombs, Get Britain to Attend the First TPNW Conference. Last month, we celebrated the first anniversary of the coming into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This remarkable treaty has the purpose of prohibiting the use, production, possession and deployment of all nuclear armaments. It has been brought to life by the global majority, both states and citizens, in their desire for a world free of nuclear weapons, ending the threat of annihilation. The nuclear weapons states, including our own, stand opposed to the treaty. Indeed, Britain has been militant in its opposition to the TPNW and has joined the US in putting pressure on other states not to engage with the treaty process. The first meeting of states parties to the treaty will be taking place in a few months' time, subject to COVID. A number of countries who aren't yet signed up, like NATO states Norway and Germany, are planning to attend as observers, but Britain flat out refuses to have anything to do with it. CND is determined to change Britain's position. We want Britain at that conference, and we're working alongside many other peace activists to make it happen. As a result, we've recently launched our Get Britain to the Nuclear Ban Conference campaign. We're asking all our members and supporters to email the Foreign Secretary, urging her to join the conference as an observer. The online action to do this is on our website. So if you haven't already emailed Liz Truss, now's the time. We have a range of campaigning materials available. And also we have the excellent new report from Rebecca Johnson entitled Nuclear Weapons Are Banned. What does this mean for Britain? And you can access that also on our website. So there is much to do to make this happen. And this evening's discussion will really help to equip us to get active and make sure Britain gets to that conference. I'm really delighted to welcome our panel this evening. We have Alexander Kmentt, Bell Ribeiro-Addy, and Jeremy Corbyn. They will each speak for 10 minutes, then we'll have a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the box. So first of all, I'm turning to Alexander. Alexander Kmentt is an Austrian diplomat, and he's one of the architects of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. He was responsible for the 2014 Vienna Conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, which paved the way for the treaty. He's also president-designate of the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW. Welcome, Alexander. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. Thanks for the kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure for me to participate in today's discussion. Having been closely involved in the process that led to the TPNW, I now have, as you said, the honor of chairing the first meeting of states parties and facilitating the preparations for it. The treaty entered into legal force, as you said, a little over a year ago after the 50th ratification. To date, we have 59 states that have ratified it and 86 have signed the treaty. It is a historic milestone. It's the first unequivocal prohibition of nuclear weapons under international law, the last category of weapons of mass destruction that was not subject to such a prohibition. And it is grounded in a thorough and facts-based understanding of the unacceptable humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, whether they're used by accident or by design, and of the considerable risks to all humanity that the possession of these weapons and the policy of nuclear deterrence entails. The focus of the treaty is not who should or could have these weapons and who can't, but that there are no right hands to handle these wrong weapons, as former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan aptly put this some years ago. The foundation of the TPNW is up-to-date research that demonstrates that the humanitarian consequences, short-term, mid-term, long-term, would be a lot more severe and a lot more interrelated and a lot more global than previously understood, and that the risks of these weapons are high and that these risks are rising. So the TPNW is a challenge to nuclear deterrence thinking. It juxtaposes the empirically demonstrable facts and knowledge about humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons with the assumptions that underpin nuclear deterrence, because at the end of the day, it is a concept, it is a theory, and it is based on assumptions, and it cannot be proven either way, and everybody actually acknowledges this. Given, however, what we know about the effects of nuclear weapons, it is clear that bar some hypothetical, theoretical circumstances and scenarios, nuclear weapons could not be used in conformity with international law. They instead threaten the security of all states by their mere existence, and consequently nuclear disarmament is a global issue, and nuclear weapons are a global security threat to all states, and all states have thus a responsibility to act. And this was really the essential element of the TPNW process, that all states, indeed all humanity, have a stake and have agency. And establishing this norm was thus a way where non-nuclear weapon states could themselves take action on nuclear disarmament rather than appeal simply to nuclear armed states. And if nuclear armed states do not take credible disarmament steps, then the international community can at least clarify, legally clarify, that the nuclear status quo does not enjoy international legitimacy. So the TPNW is not naive, and it's not an idealistic approach. It's an approach that is based on facts and based on serious security considerations of states, and who take responsible action to address this security threat. And to underpin this and the relevance of this approach, and also the level of support and the transformational potential of the TPNW, I just want to give you a few more numbers. 122 states adopted the treaty in 2017. 128 states voted in favor of the TPNW resolution at the General Assembly only last December. 138 states formally endorsed or voted in favor of the humanitarian pledge that you mentioned that paved the way for the TPNW, and 159 states co-signed a joint cross-regional statement in the UN on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in 2015. So what are the next steps? We are preparing the first meeting of states parties, which is a key milestone, a key moment to set the treaty on the right track, the first meeting where states parties get together to take decisions. We had to postpone the meeting from March because we really want to ensure inclusivity. It will now take place either in June or July. We're still working this out. Until the end of the month, we will have clarity. The TPNW is not just a comprehensive set of prohibitions, as important as this is, but it's also much more. It provides a framework for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Nuclear armed states can eliminate their stockpile and join, or they can join the treaty and eliminate their stockpile in an agreed process. This will have to be verified, of course, and the first meeting will take some decisions in this respect. The TPNW contains some very important so-called positive obligations on victim assistance and on environmental remediation. And that's a key aspect to underscore the humanitarian approach that underpins the treaty, because several of our states parties have communities that still suffer very severely to this day from nuclear weapons explosion, nuclear weapons test explosions in the past. For example, Kazakhstan, for example, the Pacific Island states, or Algeria, which is a signatory. And we want to establish in this treaty a culture of work and a culture of cooperation to address this legacy of humanitarian harm. Universalization is an obligation of the treaty. We want to work for more ratifications, of course, but probably even more importantly, we want to promote the humanitarian arguments and the rationale of the TPNW, and there we'll work on a strategy. And then scientific advice is important for this treaty, not just the technical elements related to nuclear weapons and verification, but also on the humanitarian consequences and risks. We want to scope the research, the global research that is going on those issues. And there is a lot of really important work going on which will strengthen the treaty. But above all, of course, we want to send a strong and a confident political message about the treaty, about its profound arguments and the need for more global action on nuclear disarmament. The meeting is a UN conference, so all UN member states have been invited to attend as states parties or as observers. And we will, of course, also be very welcoming for civil society organizations. But as you said rightly, nuclear armed states have so far rejected the treaty. They don't like the challenge to the nuclear hegemony, and they don't like the challenge to nuclear deterrence. They have criticized the treaty relentlessly with bogus and politically motivated arguments, and they have applied pressure and even bullying tactics to discourage, and in some cases even intimidating states from ratifying the TPNW. In my mind, this actually just demonstrates the tremendous transformational potential of this treaty, because if it would be an irrelevant treaty, why are the nuclear armed states so united in opposing it so strongly? In my view, the antagonistic approach that we have regrettably seen so far is actually a deflection tactic in order not to engage on the underlying arguments of the TPNW on humanitarian consequences and risks, because it's much easier to attack and belittle the treaty than it is to actually engage meaningfully on the arguments, most probably because these states don't have actually very convincing answers to the legitimate questions and concern about humanitarian consequences that the treaty raises. Nevertheless, this is an international conversation that urgently needs to happen. And this is also the key message that I would like to leave with you for your engagement with the UK government. One can, of course, agree or disagree with the legal dimension of the TPNW, and any state is free to decide whether or not to attend the meeting. But there's really no reason, and there's no political justification not to engage substantively and constructively with the profound underlying arguments of the TPNW. This treaty is supported by a very large number of states, the majority of the international community, and it is in my view, really the responsibility of nuclear armed states to show such constructive engagement, because at the end of the day, it is they who possess these weapons that pose a threat to the survival of humanity. The states parties of the TPNW, we're preparing this first meeting in a very serious way, and we will welcome states that are not yet supportive of the treaty, but that want to constructively engage. And in this context, what you've mentioned, the decisions by Norway and Germany, the first two NATO allies, to state their readiness of participating as observers, was very much welcomed and is really welcome and important. It's necessary to have a much broader and much more inclusive international discourse about these weapons and about our common security. And it will ultimately, I'm sure, be to the detriment of and damaging to the political standing of nuclear armed states if they continue to ignore this treaty and the wish of its supporters for constructive engagement on the profound arguments of this treaty. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Alexandra, and that's really, really helpful for our work in engaging with the government. And with that in mind, I'm really delighted to turn to our second speaker, Bell Ribeiro-Addy. Welcome, Bell. Bell is MP for Streatham, and she's also Vice Chair of Parliamentary CND. Bell plays a leading role in Parliament in holding the government to account for its actions on nuclear weapons. So, Bell, over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Always very pleased to support the work of CND. And I know I'm preaching to the converted when I say nuclear weapons don't make us safer, but I think it's important to repeat that as much as we possibly can so that people understand they're not a deterrent. They don't even tackle the modern threats that we do have to our security, which are from cyber or groups. We can't use nuclear weapons to challenge these really real threats. So what are they here for? Those countries like ours who continue to maintain their nuclear weapon system we all know, knowing what's happening, is that they've just clearly got all of their priorities wrong. So we saw the government stockpiling deadly nuclear weapons, but they couldn't stockpile life-saving medical equipment in the run-up to the pandemic. They completely axed the aid budget, but they're still planning to press ahead with Trident. They're spending billions on upgrading our missile capability, but we claim that we can't afford to give nurses a meaningful pay rise. And the government's decision to expand the UK's nuclear stockpile by 40% completely flies in the face of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In another typical move of this government, they're now intending to stop giving public figures for the nuclear arsenal, making it more difficult to scrutinise the expense involved in developing these weapons. That is wrong on so many levels, but a complete affront to democracy. And I remember during the last leadership of the Labour Party, there was a complete fixation as to whether or not Jeremy Corbyn would press the red button when he was Labour leader, and that ultimately reflects an elite preoccupation. There is nothing more deeply anti-democratic than the idea that one individual or a handful of people should hold sway over such a monumental decision as to whether or not to initiate nuclear Armageddon. And that's exactly the power that some countries like ours are giving themselves. Now, the government are trying to convince us that nuclear weaponry is the best way to keep us safe. And, you know, as I said, preaching to the converted when I say that it's all wrong. We need to have a grown-up conversation about the UK's place in the world, and the long acknowledged, ridiculousness of us having a nuclear nuclear deterrent is long overdue. And it is, again, an affront to human life that at a time when we're facing challenges like these, a global pandemic, rising poverty, a climate catastrophe, that any government would be pouring yet more money into destructive nuclear technology. The UK government are not just international outliers when it comes to nuclear weapons, unfortunately. They're also completely out of step with the UK public, who overwhelmingly support global efforts for disarmament. And you just cannot build meaningful security on the threat of mass destruction. It's just not going to work. So I think the government should move forward steps to nuclear disarmament. There are many ways in which they could do this. The first and most obvious one, and one that I know the CND are campaigning hard for at the moment, is to sign the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is what the majority of the public do want them to do. This is the first step. And, doing things such as issuing a sole purpose declaration. The UK at the moment, officially remains really on an ambiguous posture. Much of it's domestic signalling and public discussion around Trident actually implies that the system has a sole purpose to deter nuclear threats or use nuclear, or for other states to use to be armed by them. But however, this has not been clarified internationally. A mutual sole purpose declaration, which I hope would be mirrored through operational practice training and general posture, would actually help improve crisis stability and greatly reduce the risk of an accidental nuclear war. But the idea that there could even be an accidental nuclear war just completely blows my mind, and shows how dangerous even having these weapons even is. I want to see us adopt a no first use policy. Obviously, ultimately, we would not have them at all. But whilst we're going through the process of disarmament, adopt a no first use policy, that we would never fire first. We need to look towards reducing stockpiles of fissile materials, and we already know that whilst the US and Russia have gone quite a long way to reduce theirs, the UK hasn't followed suit. And given the size of this country, I don't understand how they've thought that that's a reasonable thing to do. We need to explore future reductions in warhead numbers. British nuclear reductions are in line with a policy of minimum deterrence, and what this is doing at the moment is strengthening its claim to provide some leadership in disarmament diplomacy, and that's absolutely not true. Since the UK is not actually in a position to closely negotiate away numbers with particular strategic rivals, there would be little loss from further reductions. So if it could be shown that minimum credible deterrence was possible, so it could be shown that minimum credible deterrence was possible with fewer numbers. And again, as we're going through the process of looking towards disarmament, I want to see this government pledge not to increase warhead numbers and cap the yield. We need to ultimately plan now that we have the time, now that we're looking, I hope, towards a better world, plan for a denuclearized UK security policy. The Ministry of Defence needs to table alternative security arrangements that would actually allow the UK to transition at some point in the future from nuclear deterrence towards more sustainable forms of collective security. And these proposals would have to include details of geopolitical conditions, things like that. And I think it's so key that we need to look beyond a world where people see this as the only option and get up and make grand speeches in Parliament about why we have to maintain these completely destructive and dangerous weapons. Diplomacy, as far as I'm concerned, is the way forward. And, you know, it was really great when we all were able to celebrate the treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons coming into place last year. But ultimately, what I want to see is Britain get involved with the agreement, so it can take steps forward just to join those other countries that are looking towards a world in which we don't have nuclear weapons. We've already seen what they can do, and now is as good a chance and a time as ever any to bring this ridiculous practice to an end. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Bell, and you've covered an enormous range of material there and different options that the government could pursue. But for me, the point that you made that was most compelling really was about the very human impact of the government's choices in terms of what it spends on, spending on the nuclear warheads, when we're seeing massively increasing poverty, escalating fuel bills, which the government isn't addressing in the way that some other countries are addressing, and of course this terrible cost of living crisis as a result of government policies and wrong priorities. So thank you very much indeed for that contribution. Am I right in thinking you have to go to another meeting now and you won't be able to?
I do, but I leave you in Jeremy's very capable hands.
Okay. Well, thanks very much indeed, Bell, for joining us, and thanks for all the work that you do with Parliamentary CND. And so we turn to our third speaker, Jeremy Corbyn. A big welcome for Jeremy. Jeremy is MP for Islington North and he's Vice President of CND. He's a lifelong activist for peace and justice and is much celebrated for his opposition to pressing the nuclear button. In 2014, he attended the Humanitarian Impact Conference in Vienna, which Alexander organised. And I understand, Jeremy, you're planning to go as an observer to the first meeting of States Parties. So welcome, Jeremy, and over to you.
Thanks, Kate. An absolute warm welcome to Alexander for the speech he just gave us, but also the incredible work you've done for so many years. And I thought that conference in Vienna in 2014 on the humanitarian effects of nuclear war was, to me, an amazing experience, but it also was so different to the experience in Britain, where if you think Britain and Austria, London and Vienna were both once the centers of enormous empires. In Britain, there is still often a sort of imagination that somehow or other with global Britain, we're going to recreate some kind of empire, and all that feeds into a very high level of arms expenditure and nuclear weapons. And in Austria, the whole experience is the exact opposite. You've got a place that was absolutely center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, major city in every conceivable way, and the whole palace given over to discussing the humanitarian consequences of nuclear warfare and nuclear weapons. And so I want to say on behalf of millions of people, Alexander, thank you very much for what you did there and what the work that you continue to do. And yes, I will be coming to the review conference. I just sent you a message trying to work out roughly when it was going to be, because obviously that would help. But I'm looking forward to being there and obviously making any contribution that's helpful towards the cause of ridding the world of nuclear weapons. And as Kate pointed out, one of the most interesting media headlines I ever had was that I was a threat to Britain's security and indeed to world security because I was not prepared to use nuclear weapons. I'm still trying to work this one out, how you can be a threat to the world by not threatening to blow it up. You know, it's a complex argument, which no doubt when I get older I'll understand. But I think we should just think for a moment tonight on the achievements of the Global Ban Treaty, which is minimized in the British media to the extent of barely reporting it at all. And there's this sort of media consensus that somehow or other Britain's place in the world is strengthened by having nuclear weapons, and that to get rid of them would diminish us and probably mean we'd lose our place on the UN Security Council. And we therefore go into this comfortable assertion that security means the ability to destroy each other many, many times over. Yet the highest figure is 159 countries in the world. Think that figure, 159 countries in the world that have signed a declaration which is not supportive of the idea that nuclear weapons bring security. There are 195 members of the United Nations. That is only 36 short of the totality of all nations. Those that hold nuclear weapons are a small minority, and those that have majority support for nuclear weapons are in an even smaller minority rather. So I think we need to just reflect on that. From the foundation of the peace movements, well, peace movements were founded a very long time ago. Their ancestry goes back to the 19th century, if not the 18th century. But in the modern age, so to speak, the post-nuclear age, the growth of peace movements in the 1950s were, to begin with, very marginal, but gradually had more and more effect and brought about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the ABM Treaty, testing treaties, and so many others were brought about because governments were under popular pressure to be seen to be responsible and therefore reduce or get rid of nuclear warheads altogether. And post-1990, there was a very significant reduction in nuclear warheads all around the world and the growth of nuclear-free zones, all of which I would support, obviously, and would be an important way forward. But the big weakness in the NPT was the declared nuclear weapon states being asked to take steps towards disarmament rather than required to disarm, whereas the rest of the signatories were required never to obtain or proliferate nuclear weapons. And I can understand the politics of the time, but it seems a very outdated concept that most of the adherents to the treaty are expected to legally fulfill obligations, and those that have nuclear weapons are expected to do something rather less. And so having many of us on this call, having battled the issue of peace and the issues of nuclear disarmament and had many, many debates over it over many, many years, I think the Global Ban Initiative was incredibly welcome and very important because it changed the debate into a global solution rather than actions required of states on their own, sort of unilateral actions. It required a more universal one, and I think that's hugely important. And I absolutely support it, and I support the language that's been used in it as well. And I recognise that all that went into that about humanity, and sometimes we sort of forget the human argument about it. Bell puts it very well. Sadly, if I stepped out my front door and walked down the street and asked the first 20 people I meet what they thought about nuclear weapons, older people would probably tell me that they were appalling and should be got rid of. Middle-aged people might say, well, what, maybe, don't know. Younger people would probably look at me rather blankly and say, what is a nuclear weapon? They would simply say, what is it? So we're kind of living with this existence of the ultimate weapons of mass destruction. And many of our people are completely unaware of what they are, what power they hold, and the ability they have to destroy all human life on this planet if enough of them were used at the same time. And so I do think sometimes you have to use the blunt arguments about the danger to all of us of just the mere existence of nuclear weapons. And so I hope that we can put out some fairly blunt messages at the same time. However, one other thing I want to say, and I want to conclude with these thoughts, Kate, is that we've been through the COVID pandemic, or many countries are still going through it. We've seen the greed of big pharma in denying vaccines to large numbers of people by cost. And we've seen the profit taking that's gone from it. And we've seen inequality starkly. We've also seen in recent years the consequences of war, of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of Libya, of Syria, of the massive numbers of people that become refugees and endlessly search for a country that will take them and go through the most horrible experiences trying to get to that position. They are victims of war. They are the consequences of the military thinking that brought about those conflicts. We're now going through the stress of what will happen on the Ukraine-Russia border, where there are masses of troops, Russian troops, NATO forces, both sides of the border, massive arms flowing into the area, massive arms exports going rapidly to the Ukraine, and sort of blood-curdling statements being made that we're all prepared to go to war, instead of looking for the origins of the conflict and looking for the possibility of achieving peace rather than war. And in that, of course, there are nuclear armed powers involved. NATO clearly has massive access to nuclear weapons, so does Russia. I'm not saying that either side are proposing nuclear war at the present time, but if somebody lets slip the dogs of war, where do they stop? Where do they stop? And doesn't then the whole nuclear option, they'll no doubt be termed strategic or battlefield or localized or something. It is a very serious danger. So it is about changing the narrative on war and peace. It's also about changing the narrative on nuclear weapons themselves. And so when people often put to me, they say, well, okay, I sort of understand your point about nuclear weapons, and I think I understand your point about trying to reduce the huge proportion of spending we have on armaments in Britain, but what does it mean for our security? And so you then have to ask yourself the question, what is security? Is security the ability to kill your enemy, to destroy your neighbor, to indeed, in the case of the 6 declared nuclear weapon state, destroy the whole planet? Or is security that which refugees are seeking? Refugees lack housing, lack health, lack education, lack any secure future. Isn't real security knowing that you're going to live in a clean environment, your children will get education, all of you will have access to healthcare, and that you will live in a world where we will not be constantly seeking enemies and war by exporting arms into war zones, knowing full well what the consequences of them are. And so I welcome the work you've done, Alexander, and welcome the work that's been done on the Global Ban Treaty, and I absolutely support it, and looking forward to being in Vienna to do that. But I do think we need to accompany it with an education exercise about the reality of nuclear weapons and about the isolation of the political leadership of the declared nuclear weapon state compared to what is global opinion in support of a global ban treaty. This should be an exciting moment, and surely to goodness, post COP26, post COVID, isn't the lesson that we need to invest in health, in education, in sustainability, in green energy, rather than putting all this money into weapons of mass destruction? That's got to be the choice. Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you, Alexander.
Thanks very much indeed, Jeremy, and those are really important points. I've got some questions coming in now. I think what I'm going to do while people think of more questions, I'm going to put a couple, first of all, to Alexander, if you don't mind. So I've got two, and people, if Alexander and Jeremy can keep their replies kind of quick, then we'll be able to get as many questions in as possible. I've got two for you, though, Alexander. First of all, from Linda Rogers: how can organisations in non-complying states gain access as observers, please? So that's a practical question. And then I've got another one, which is about the provision within the TPNW for environmental and human remediation for those who've been impacted by testing. The question is, if the UK joined the TPNW, what would it have to do regarding the testing victims, particularly in the First Nations peoples in Australia and other parts of the world where testing took place? So if you wouldn't mind having a go at those questions first.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks for the questions. The first one, in terms of access, we want to be extremely open. The first meeting of states parties, the TPNW in general, we want this to be an avant-garde treaty also in the way we approach rules of procedure. The whole process was like that. We are welcoming to civil society, we are welcoming to experts. We understand that the solution to the nuclear weapons issue is by having a very much broader societal discourse about these issues. So in terms of access, civil society organizations can have access. Of course, there will be limits as far as the pandemic and room capacity are concerned, but there will be many side events as well. It is coordinated by ICANN, and ICANN will handle the registration for civil society, essentially. However, that's of course not yet in place because the date is not yet fixed. So we'll have clarity about the date by the end of the month. It will be either in June or in July, and then letters will go out and details on how states can and civil society organizations can attend. On the positive obligation on assisting victims and environmental remediation of testing, essentially the treaty puts the prime responsibility of the state in which the victims are. So it is the prime responsibility will be for the state to look after the people who are victims. But of course, the whole concept of the treaty is based on a very cooperative model. So if the UK were to join the treaty, the UK, we would hope, would engage in a cooperative engagement with the countries in which nuclear tests have taken place. And of course, this implies money, but not only. It implies technical assistance, education, and all sorts of aspects. So it's a very cooperative rather than a punitive model that the TPNW foresees. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexander. And then Jeremy, I'm going to turn to you with a couple of questions. I hope you don't mind if I put in your direction a question that came in from Bell, for Bell, I should say. It's about Labour Party policy, so you may not wish, or you may or may not wish to comment on that. I'll leave that entirely up to you. But Linda Walker says you make lots of great points, Bell, about what the UK should be doing. But are any of these points official Labour Party policy? No first use, a commitment to sign the treaty, a willingness to reduce our warheads. So that's one. Kathy Page in the chat said, do you think there's any point in writing to Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, Boris Johnson? So a bit about, your opinion about the value, I suppose, of writing to people on the question. And then Mike Kiley's put a question there about the PACAC Select Committee, which I'm not familiar with. He says they've refused to report on the process through which the UK would go in order to identify new targets for its warheads. And they have been detargeted since 1994. Is there an opportunity to raise this matter in Parliament? And I think that's an interesting question, because sometimes, obviously, we put down the questions and we get a bit fobbed off. Do you think it's worth campaigners getting questions of that nature put down in Parliament? So, Jeremy, over to you on those.
Thanks, Kate. They're all very good questions. On Labour Party policy, as everyone on this call knows, that the party policy, even during my leadership, was never to get rid of nuclear weapons in their entirety. It was to support the NPT and negotiations, although I was hoping to move it along a lot further and a lot faster towards the position that I outlined when I spoke a few minutes ago. There is a strong feeling amongst constituency parties, and majority and party members are certainly opposed to nuclear weapons and support CND's general position. Where the debate fell down was on jobs in the manufacture of weapons and the vessels and the aircraft that are involved in all of that. And it is about an arms conversion strategy. And you've heard me speak on this many times, Kate. I'm strongly of the view that the peace movement has to come up with a credible arms conversion strategy that does not involve job losses, that does involve public investment for the creation of sustainable vessels and so on that can be put into multi-use, and obviously ending nuclear weapons. And so the party position does support the non-proliferation treaty. And I think it is necessary to keep on campaigning on that. I also think there is a very widespread support for the nuclear ban treaty, because it's different from the advances we made in the past on unilateral nuclear disarmament. It's a very different concept. It's a global agreement. And I think we should be pushing very hard for the British government to be represented at the Vienna conference, and that they should take part in it in a meaningful way, as they should take part in the nuclear review conference. Somebody put in saying, is it worth, I can't remember who it was, worth writing and so on to party leaders and MPs? Well, you have to campaign in whatever way you can. If you don't do anything, then nothing's going to change. You have to keep trying to put that message across and keep that debate alive in the media, because I'm always struck with how different the media is in Britain a very much declared nuclear weapon state, compared to the debate that takes place in other countries that absolutely do not have, want, or support nuclear weapons, where it's a sort of given. And therefore, campaigning and putting pressure on the media is important, and putting that pressure on MPs. And now that it looks as though restrictions on actual physical visiting to Parliament are soon going to be lifted altogether, I think we should be planning for a lobby on taking part in the global ban, a serious lobby of all MPs on it. As soon as Alexander's got the date, obviously we can work around that as a form of lobbying and pressure as to the British government's involvement, and I'll certainly do my best to take it up in Parliament. The last question is on the targeting of nuclear warheads. I honestly don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think it is absolutely worth taking it up, because there was an assumption during the days of the Cold War, when nuclear weapons were seen as de rigueur for both sides of the nuclear war, when it was pretty obvious who was targeted by them. It's not obvious at all who's targeted by them. And as many of us made the point at the time, when that horrible attack took place in New York on the 11th of September 2001, nuclear weapons were of no help whatsoever to a random terrorist attack. They're no help at all in dealing with those kind of issues. It is a question of bringing about security through dealing with the injustices and social issues, as well as the injustices that are being fed by the arms trade in many parts of the world. So certainly we do need to raise that, and I'd be happy to do that. I don't honestly know who they're targeted on at the moment. I do remember the apocryphal story of Ronald Reagan arriving in Moscow, and he suddenly found he didn't have the nuclear briefcase in his hand. And somebody said, well, where is it? What's happened to it? They said, well, you won't need it, Mr. President. He said, well, why not? We're in the hands of the enemy. He said, precisely, because if you press the button, it's you that will be blown up first.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm just going to pick up on one point that you made there. This is about the jobs question, jobs and nuclear disarmament. I think you said that the peace movement had to come up with a credible plan.
Yeah.
In fact, we don't need to do that, as you know, because the workforces, time and again, have come up with numerous fantastic plans, that we wholeheartedly support.
Yeah.
And what we've found is that, yes, they are there, but what has been lacking is the political will in governments, or even in kind of putative governments, as it were, to make it clear that they will follow that through, to have a new defence industrial policy that doesn't include nuclear weapons, but re-skills for other more socially useful purposes. So, I think...
Kate, I agree with you. I'm sorry if I didn't put it terribly well. I wasn't trying to guilt trip the peace movement into doing something they've already done. I fully recognise we do support that. I think it's a question of promoting that public debate. As we manage to successfully promote a public debate about green industrial revolution, creating jobs, not threatening jobs, the same thing can be done with the arms industry.
Absolutely. Glad that we agree as usual, Jeremy. Right, so I'm going to put a few more questions. We've got a lot of stuff coming in. I'm just going to put a few out there to you both, and then invite you both to come back on them, or any others that you've spotted that I haven't. But I'm going to highlight some which I think are key. The first is from Ray Street. She says, what are we going to do about NATO, which has a policy of not only retaining nuclear weapons, but first use of nuclear weapons? Dominated by the USA, NATO states were urged to not support the TPNW. We need education too, as Jeremy says, on NATO and its dangerous nuclear policies. So thanks for that, Ray. Then Tom Cuthbert says, can the joint statement from the P5 in January be trusted, or is there a problem? Tom thinks that there is. And then a couple more are picking up out of the chat. Apologies if I haven't got them all, but there's one from Dan Ross, which is quite long, but I'm just going to summarise that, Dan, by saying you're pointing out why countries like North Korea, for example, you say DPRK, you say it seems perfectly rational for DPRK, for instance, to retain its nuclear weapons program in the face of US-led aggression. So that kind of countries thinking that they themselves need them for their defence, as indeed our own government says. So maybe you could comment a little bit, perhaps, on that. And then Alan Debenham from Taunton, Alan's a GP. Just take the first part of your question because it's more nuclear focused. When talking about nuclear weapons, surely we must not forget they're joined at the hip to nuclear power. Why must Labour always come over so strong, especially in Parliament, for the two nuclears? So I think that that's an important point, particularly as we're seeing the kind of attempts to rehabilitate nuclear power as a kind of solution or partial solution to climate change. So that is indeed very topical. So Alexander, would you like to go first in tackling some of those or all of those?
Thanks a lot. Yes, won't be able to tackle all of them. There was one question that I've just seen popping up, which I think is very important, which I want to tackle. Is one participant said that I think his or her MP says the TPNW undermines the NPT. And I just want to say this is exactly part of the bogus and politically motivated negative narrative about the TPNW that is just absolutely wrong. Of course, the TPNW is fully complementary with the NPT. It is a clear implementation of the nuclear disarmament provision of the NPT, and by highlighting the humanitarian consequences of and risks of nuclear weapons, of course, it strengthens the taboo against nuclear weapons, which is a key non-proliferation measure. So the TPNW supports the two main pillars of the NPT, nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And this is one of the arguments that is persistently made by the nuclear armed state and is just complete rubbish. Sorry for use of better word. P5 statement, which was essentially, it was a reiteration of the P5 of the Reagan-Gorbachev statement from the 1980s that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought, which of course is very important as a statement, but of course it needs to be backed up by actions. And unfortunately, what we see in terms of actions, we actually see an arms race developing in front of our eyes, a nuclear arms race developing in front of our eyes. So it's very important that this statement is made, but it needs to be backed up. And I want to just add one point. Why can a nuclear war not be won and must not be fought? It's because of the humanitarian consequences. What else? So it is actually, if you actually think the statement of the P5 through, it is a reinforcement of the arguments of the TPNW. And just one short comment on NATO. It's only since 2010 that NATO refers to itself as a nuclear alliance. It wasn't the case before. The North Atlantic Treaty, of course, does not say anything itself about nuclear weapons. So it's a political choice. It is a political choice that have been taken, and it would be a political choice to change that. And there are very interesting legal analysis of NATO countries that conclude very clearly that NATO membership in itself is not at all a hindrance to become a member of the TPNW. Of course, this country would have to disengage from the nuclear aspects of NATO, but not of NATO itself. So that's an important discussion that I think hopefully the TPNW will also contribute to. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. That's really, really interesting. And we're talking about NATO quite a lot at the moment because we're building up towards the NATO Heads of State Summit in Madrid in June. So the peace movement in Europe and Spain in particular is, starting that process of discussions. And I think that that's important, that should be very much part of it. Jeremy, over to you for
Thanks.
concluding remarks.
I think Alexander made an important point there, that it's only in the past 10 years that NATO has badged itself as a nuclear alliance and kept on referring to that as the basis of its power and its influence. It wasn't always the case, because there were member states of NATO that were avowedly non-nuclear for a very long time, and so the language on that has changed. As to the questions put forward, particularly Dan and Alan's question, the question of arms spending is an important one, and that fits in with the nuclear argument. And I find it very depressing that the USA has now just passed the biggest defense budget ever in its history, and that Biden sent a request to Congress for approval of his defense budget, and they sent him back even more money than he asked for. They said it wasn't sufficient, and so it was lobby pressure in the Senate and Congress that ended up increasing the defense budget, partly on arguments about jobs and to a lesser extent arguments about security. And it looks to me as though Biden is returning to the heavily global role for the US, which was beginning to look as though it might be something that was in retreat, in the same way that on this side of the Atlantic, Boris Johnson and his global Britain strategy means that we're basically going back to where we were somewhere before the 1960s, with the idea that Britain, a country of 65 million people, can afford to have bases all around the world and can have an ability to militarily intervene at 24 hours notice anywhere in the world. Well, it is a big ask of a very small number of military personnel. So how do you deal with it? Either by persuading other countries to join in, or we spend even more on, don't worry about the bell, it won't last long. It's Parliament finishing for the day. So it does mean that there's going to be therefore an accelerator on defence expenditure in Britain, and more demands for more and more people to join the armed forces at the same time as we're cutting overseas aid expenditure massively, but also now proposing a period of austerity on local government health and education expenditure. And so the contrast is pretty obvious, that we're spending all this money on a military presence all around the world, which then leads on to the question of the alleged security that's brought by nuclear weapons. Now, I don't believe it brings security. I don't suppose anybody in this call or at this meeting believes it brings security. There are some people, sadly, who think that us having nuclear weapons means there's no danger of being attacked by any other nuclear power because we've got them. On that basis, we'd have many more of them. And on that basis, every country in the world should get nuclear weapons on the basis it might be attacked. However, the argument doesn't stack up. Look at the nuclear weapons-free zones. Look at the countries that have quite specifically and deliberately abandoned nuclear weapons, and look at the relative security that brings in not having to have these massive levels of arms expenditure. The point that's put in one of the calls is about the logic of North Korea, for example, developing nuclear weapons on the basis that it keeps the US out of their hair. I'm not sure that the US necessarily wanted to invade North Korea anyway, but there has been some engagement with North Korea. And I would argue very strongly that North Korea's economic problems are massive. Poverty levels are huge. Food supply is a difficulty for them. And they are a very isolated country. And if they actually spent more resources on social and human development rather than nuclear weapons, they would be a lot better off and could develop a good relationship with neighboring countries. Now, I'm not in favor of anybody invading anywhere else, but I'm not in favor of anyone developing more nuclear weapons and the dangers that go with them and the consequences of it. The last point is how we go forward from here. The nuclear ban treaty is an amazing step forward, and as has been put in the chat box, 159 countries signing up to a form of it is wonderful and is a huge step forward. I hope the Vienna conference can build on that, and whilst I was disappointed that it's been adjourned from March to the summer, I fully understand the reasons why, but it has been. That actually gives us more time to build up the political and public pressure on it, gives us more time to try and have some global media initiatives. So can we not, from CND and from yourself, Alexander, and others, try and get all our peace organization friends around the world to try and give the same message, so we build up some sort of international media pressure on it? Because at the moment there's an imbalance. It simply is not reported on the mainstream media in the USA or most of Europe, and that we have to get across just what the consequences of more nuclear weapons, nuclear rearmament, and the political cost, the social cost, but also the horrendous danger they pose to all of us. And so it's up to us to get that message across. It's never been easy, and it never will be easy, but the alternative is to do nothing and just to allow the whole idea of mutually armed destruction to be once again returned to centerpiece as we recreate a Cold War. I, for one, do not want a war in Ukraine. I don't want a war between NATO forces and Russia. What I want to see is a serious peace process, and I'm pleased that some European leaders seem to be thinking that way and trying to undertake serious diplomatic initiatives to prevent a war taking place. I would certainly want to be part of those serious diplomatic initiatives to stop this descent into a conflict. Goodness knows where it might end.
Thanks very much indeed, Jeremy, and I'm sure we all concur with your points. Absolutely. We want to see a more peaceful world, and we want to see a turn away from this warmongering, particularly on the part of our own government here. I also very much agree with your point about the postponement of the TPNW first meeting. We're disappointed, but let's treat it as an opportunity. We have more time to build up that head of steam here in Britain in favour of that conference, of that treaty process, and let's do all we can to ensure that our government is on board. And so please, everybody out there, do everything you can, use our campaigning materials, get in touch with the Foreign Secretary and pile on that pressure onto the government to make sure that they have a presence there in an observer capacity at that conference. So big thank you to Alexander. Thank you so much for joining us. Real strength and solidarity to you in your work advancing the TPNW. And as ever, Jeremy, enormous thanks to you for your principled positions and all that you do for the cause of peace and justice. And thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Really good discussion. And look forward to seeing you in Vienna, Alexander.